So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this a new class of the course in Advanced in Semiotics, a course dedicated to the topic of critical semiotics. First of all, let me be sure that we are connected, so please give me a sign of the fact that you hear me, that you can hear me and see me. I don't want to lose your attention or your connection. Thank you very much. So we can proceed. There's always this problem with online connections that one is never sure of the feedback until it is produced and created. Thank you also for anticipating our meeting. Today I will move from Turin to Freiburg in Germany, where I'll be visiting professor for this semester. So I'll have to catch a train later on, and as a consequence it was necessary to meet a little bit earlier. But it's not so early for you, it's a little bit early here because it's 7:15 in the morning. But I hope this was not too much of an inconvenience for you. So let me retrace a little bit the path that we have walked through together. We are moving in the very vast and wide framework of semiotics. At the same time, within this semiotics, we are selecting a narrower perimeter, which is the one designated by the denomination critical semiotics, a semiotics that is applied to a critical understanding of present-day societies and cultures. And within this narrower perimeter, we have also selected a specific topic, which is the topic of ideology. A topic that we are investigating through different perspectives and in relation to several subtopics. So we have introduced semiotics, critical semiotics, then the concept of ideology. We have applied the semiotic concept of ideology to different objects. These objects are quite abstract because they compose the scene of meaning and meaningfulness in most human societies. So we have started with agency, for instance. You remember last week, we talked about this ability of acting into the world, which is an abstract philosophical concept, but at the same time it has tremendous consequences. Yesterday I was at a symposium on the Como Lake. It's a beautiful place. So there were some German scholars, some Italian scholars. And many of the scholars were lawyers. They were actually scholars in law, juridical reflection, philosophy of law, legal theory. There too, at some stage, we started to talk about ideologies of agency. Why? Because, well, these legal scholars were mainly specialists in the field of law applied to copyright, law applied to patents, and also law applied to copyright in the specific domain of the arts. Now, you must know that there are different conceptions of what art is. There are different conceptions of what an artwork is, but there are also diverging conceptions of how to protect the relation between an author and an artwork, between a painter and a painting, a sculpture and its creator. Depending on these different conceptions of the relation, diverging regimes of copyright emerge. And in these ideologies of authorship, what is important is also the concept of agency. You see, some years ago, there was a debate between Italian scholars, international scholars, but also Chinese scholars, in particular Chinese professors from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Zhang Jiang, about the concept of the author. Because a very famous scholar in semiotics and also in other disciplines, Roland Barthes, wrote a very influential paper at the end of the 1960s, claiming that the author had died, that the Western culture was actually experiencing the death of the author. What did it mean? It meant that according to Roland Barthes, there was a new perspective that had been embraced by social sciences, had been embraced by the theory of literature, the theory of cinema, according to which an artwork, a novel for example, it should not be seen from the point of view of the intentions of its creator, the intentions of its author. So what is important when we study War and Peace, when we study a Chinese novel, an Italian novel, is not to investigate the psychology of the author, the personality of the author, or the biography of the author. This might be interesting, might be relevant, but what is even more relevant in the perspective of especially 1960s and 1970s semiotics is the way in which this novel is constituted by language. It is structured by language, and it is inhabited not only by the author that has given rise to the materiality of this novel, but it is inhabited also by all those who come into contact with this novel, with its signifying structure, and somehow start to interact with it somehow, and sometimes also they start with play with it, without excluding the possibility that this play might also become a misplay, might become a misinterpretation. So Roland Barthes, in this very famous article, was somehow deconstructing, or at least he was downplaying, the myth of the author, of the personality, of the subjectivity of the author that had been extremely dominating and prevailing in the previous history of critical studies or literary theory or a history of literature. This approach that privileges the personality, the subjectivity, the authorship of the one who has given rise to the materiality of the artwork is actually so predominant in recent history that has also shaped, in many cases, the prevailing educational approach to artworks. So in many secondary schools around the world, what is studied about poetry, what is studied about literature is, first of all, the biography of the author, where the author lived, how he lived, what conceptions he had. And nevertheless, this approach might be declining in academia or in advanced research, but it's still adopted in a very spontaneous way. So if you ask the common man on the street what he or she thinks about a novel, well, the first idea will be to connect this novel with a writer. People, well, not now because there is this pandemic, but people go massively to literary festival because they want to meet the author. They want to meet the author of a novel, but they also want to meet the filmmaker of a movie. They want to meet the artist. Now, what happens when people go to an art gallery or go to a museum exhibition, to the opening of a new exhibition, because they want to meet, see, listen to the painter, the artist, the visual artist who has given rise to this new exhibition and its artworks? Well, usually there is someone, a journalist or a specialist in art, a curatorship, that who starts interviewing the artist, and he starts also asking some questions that artists usually hate. The question that artists hate the most is the question, so what does it mean? What does your novel mean? What does your painting mean? And this is very common, especially in those cases in which meaning is conveyed in a way, by the artwork is conveyed in a way that is not structured according to common sense. For instance, in an exhibition of abstract art, contemporary abstract art, paintings that do not actually contain any figures, that is, they don't contain any representations of recognizable elements of reality. So people go to an exhibition of this kind, and the painter is there, and the journalist is there, and the curator is there, and someone asks, well, but this conjunction of stains of color and lines and in material objects arranged in a very strange way, but what does it mean? And artists hate this question. They usually do not answer this question, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how to answer this question. Why? Because the author of an artwork is not always the most knowledgeable person about the meaning of the artwork that he or she has actually given rise to from the material point of view. When we are trying to perform this operation, which is a fundamental in semiotics, the operation of interpretation. What is interpretation? Interpretation is attributing a defined, determined meaning to a text, to a situation, to a practice, to something that in the world seems to be a meaningful occasion, an occasion for meaning. So when we have a conversation with a friend, when we read a novel, when we go to the movies, when we watch TV, when we walk through the street, we are constantly interpreting. But there are some occasions that have been singled out by culture, by many cultures in the world, the cultures of writing especially, as specific and privileged occasions for interpretation. So whenever we read a novel, it is not only that we might by accident interpret it, we are actually asked to interpret it. We are implicitly told, well, this material object, this paper, these characters, this ink, or more recently this iPad, shows something to you, shows some entities to you that are crucially signs to be interpreted. We cannot read a novel without interpret it. Just in order to follow the story that is narrated in a novel, we must actually, at a certain level, interpret the novel itself. The same goes for many situations in reality, and also when we do not interact with artworks or with writing or with the products of artistic creation. When we have a conversation with a friend, we must actually interpret what the friend says. Otherwise, we are just absent-mindedly receiving the sounds of his voice or of her voice. So interpretation is a central operation of semiotics. It is a central operation of the human species, the way through which the human species cognitively interacts with the environment. But as I was saying, culture has also and is constantly selecting some specific occasions in which this activity of interpretation is even more crucial, is even more important. Whenever we find not only meaning, casual meaning in a conversation during a walk, looking at the landscape, walking through a park, but we come across meaning that is somehow condensed in the frame of a text that implicitly tells us, well, I'm here as a novel, I'm here as a painting, I'm here as a symphony, and you must actually interpret me in the best possible way. So, what is the best interpretation? Granted that interpretation is central in the human species, it is central in many societies and cultures. It must be underlined that these societies and the cultures have different attitudes toward interpretation. For instance, think about fundamentalists of every kind. Political fundamentalists, religious fundamentalists, fundamentalists that apply to any sort of text. What is the attitude of the fundamentalist? The attitude of the fundamentalist is to say, well, this is my text, this is my sacred text, the Bible, the Quran, and so on and so forth. This text is fundamental, is central, it is of key importance for me and for my community, and this text has only one interpretation. There are no alternative interpretations. There is only one correct way to interpret this text. Now, this is the typical attitude of the fundamentalist, which has a specific semiotic ideology behind it, a specific semiotic ideology of interpretation. According to this specific semiotic ideology, it is actually not legitimate to interpret that particular text because that particular text has only one voice. This is the case especially for texts that are central in religious fundamentalism, for instance, in which any alternative way of interpreting a text is banned, is prohibited. But this is also the semiotic ideology of interpretation that is behind certain schools of in literary theory or art theory that claim that, well, there is only one way of interpreting a novel, and this way is actually to philologically read the text and understand what the intentions of the author were. So we must actually ask the author, and if the author has died, if the author is not living anymore, we must reconstruct the intentions of the author through studying, for instance, manuscripts. This is what a traditional philology does. There is a thorough, in-depth studies of changes, for instance, in different manuscripts that relate a story along the time, in order to try to understand how the creative intentions of the author changed through time. This is not the semiotic ideology of semiotics. I was mentioning this article by Roland Barthes that was criticizing the idea of the author, that was claiming that the author is actually dead. The author is not, of course, empirically dead. It might be also living as a person, but it is not living in the text, meaning that the text is something different from the author that has given rise to it. So how can we interpret a text? How can we better interpret a text? How can we best give meaning to a text if the strategy of just asking the author is not available? Why is it not available? Well, in many cases because the author is not there anymore, because we cannot contact him or her, but also because, as I was suggesting with the example of an artist of contemporary non-figurative art, the author is not either the most knowledgeable and the most credited person to talk about his or her own artwork, for many reasons. The first reason is that when a painter paints an artwork, for instance, when a contemporary painter paints an abstract piece of work, an abstract piece of painting, it is exactly through that act of painting, it is exactly through that artwork that he or she, the artist, wants to convey some meaning. As a consequence, if we ask a painter what the meaning of his or her artwork is, we are actually asking him not an answer, but a translation. So we are asking him or her, we are asking the artist to translate the artwork, which is already meaningful, but is meaningful in its own terms and using its own particular language, to translate its meaning into a verbal language. But the artist is not always the most gifted and apt person to perform this translation. That's why it is very important to have critics. It is very important to have critical reviewers. It is important to have literary scholars and theoreticians or art historians or people who are actually able to perform this translation much better than the author itself. So that when I, the art critic, go to an exhibition, when I, a literary scholar, read a novel, I can perceive the meaning that is enshrined in this artwork, but I can also translate it into another kind of discourse, which is the verbal discourse of literary reviews, for instance. So the importance of this figure, which is in many cases a sort of a professional figure, is of absolute centrality. Now, so this is one of the reasons for which the author is not always the most knowledgeable person about the meaning of the artwork that he or she, the author, has given rise to from the material and structural point of view. The other reason is that the author not always perfectly controls the artwork. This is evident especially in the so-called fine arts. It is evident in painting, it is evident in sculpture, but it is also evident in filmmaking. So there are some film directors, think about Hitchcock, think about Kubrick, think about also contemporary directors like Christopher Nolan, who are obsessed with controlling every possible detail of the movie, from the soundtrack to the editing, to the shots, to the casting, and so on and so forth. They want to have a perfect control of what is actually meaningful in the movie in order to have a perfect grasp of that particular communication that is going to take place when the movie is actually shown. There are other filmmakers and other film directors, think about the great film director Fellini, for instance, who do not work in the same way. they arrange a spectacle with many stories, with many characters, with different faces, but they do not try actually to control every detail of it. On the contrary, they give rise to a sort of creative chaos that is meant to convey a meaning, but always in cooperation with the interpretive attitudes and moves of the spectator. So who is right? Who is right in the extent to which the final artwork is controlled? Who is better? Is it better to try to control an artwork to the smallest details? It is better to control all the elements of a movie, of a filmic text, of a filmic experience? Or on the contrary, is it better to leave a lot of freedom to the spectator? I know this is a matter of style, but what is important to underline is the fact that in both extremes, in both options, there is a semiotic ideology once again. There is sort of a myth. The first myth is the myth of control. We cannot control an artwork. We cannot perfectly determine how this artwork will actually signify. A movie, for instance, is a tremendously complex textual experience. It is a textual experience that hit two of our senses, at least, the vision and the hearing. But it is also composed of a myriad of elements. A good director must be able to coordinate all these elements. But there is always something that the director will not be able to control. And you will say, well, but this is not the case with novels. This is not the case with artists that do not use images, do not use bodies, do not use music, lights and colors, but use simply words. But how do our words communicate? How do our words communicate? What is the way in which our words produce meaning? It is a common experience of everyone of us, that our language, our verbal language, is full of ambiguities. We cannot control the meaning of a conversation. Sometimes we have a simple conversation with a friend, with a relative, and this simple conversation gives rise to misunderstandings, gives rise to ambiguities. Why? Because we cannot perfectly control the meaning of verbal language, even in very simple circumstances. So how can we pretend that a literary author, that a novelist, that a poet can actually perfectly control what the meaningful effect of his or her work will be? Well, you might say, yes, but a novelist is a professional writing. A novel is actually supposed to have a better grasp of the meaning of words and control this meaning much better than the common man, the man on the street, the layman. But this is true only to a certain extent. It's true that the novelist can play with verbal language in average much better than the layman or the common man in the street. But it is also true that a novel or a poem is a tremendously complex arrangement of words whose final effect of meaning the author can only partially determine. The author does not communicate directly to the reader. The brain of the author does not directly transmogrify into the brain of the reader. This is how medieval theologians, medieval scholars would imagine the communication between or among angels. In ancient times, in the Christian Middle Ages, theologians would think that angels would communicate in this way. An angel, A, would think or conceive a certain thought, and automatically another angel B would receive this same thought without any necessary intermediation, without the intermediation of language. But this is a myth, is the myth of a telepathic communication, the myth that meaning might actually pass directly from one mind, human mind, to another human mind. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, we're not able to do that. We must convey the meaning that is in our mind through a materiality that is perceptible by the senses of another person. But in this passage from what is in our mind to the materiality of language, something is translated, something is lost, something is gained as well. So, when this passage takes place in a common conversation, but also in a novel, there is always the possibility for language to create some opportunities of meaningfulness and interpretation that were not actually present in the intentions of the author. So, as I was suggesting before, the author does not speak directly to the reader. The novelist does not speak directly to the reader, does not communicate directly to the reader. The author, what the author does is actually to communicate to an image of the reader, to an idea of the reader that the author has in mind. The author, through the novel, through the painting, through the movie, but also through the advertisement, through the piece of pop culture, through the song, and so on and so forth, does not communicate straightforwardly to an audience, but to an idea of audience that the same author has in mind. We are empirical authors. What does it mean, empirical authors? That when we take a book from our bookshelf and read it, when we go to the cinema and watch a movie, when we switch our music equipment on and we listen to a song, we are actually empirical subjects receiving these sounds, receiving these images, receiving this meaning through the form of a book, through the form of a song, through the form of a movie. So we are empirical receivers of this message. But when these messages were created, they were not created for us specifically. The author didn't actually know as specific receivers, specific subjects receiving this meaning. On the contrary, the author had a certain idea of the reader that would have subsequently received the meaning of the artwork. And vice versa. Vice versa. Reciprocally, when we, the receivers, obtain this meaning, when we receive meaning from an artwork, from a novel, from a painting, what we actually come up with is not an image of the empirical author, of the real author behind a novel. When we read War and Peace, we do not actually have access to the person of Tolstoy, to the mind of Tolstoy, to the intentions of Tolstoy. We come up with an idea of the author. We come up with a certain understanding of what the author might have wanted to communicate to us through that artwork. So you see, this communication is not a direct communication. It is not a communication between an author and a receiver, between a writer and a reader, between a filmmaker and a spectator, between a song composer and someone who listens to this song. It is actually something that always goes through a certain modelization, the creation of a model. So a model reader is created by the author, and it is actually enshrined into the text. The text is a proposal to a model reader that will then take this text and interpret it. And the author tries to guide the interpretation of the text that he or she has created by disseminating along the text some clues, some hints, some strategies of reading that the model reader, the ideal reader, will have to adopt, will have to follow in order to grasp the meaning of the novel itself. So the author of a novel, the author of a poem, actually wants us to understand what the meaning of the novel is. But he or she cannot control this understanding completely. Why? Because there is always the possibility of a misunderstanding, of a miscoding. We might, for instance, I might, for instance, read a poem that belongs to a classical Chinese poetry, a classical Chinese literature. I might read this poem, I might interpret this poem, I might come up with an idea of the author that has created this poem, and at the same time, this meaning I come up with might be completely at odds with the meaning that actually the poet himself, or herself, many centuries ago, tried to enshrine into this poem. So this is a case of misinterpretation. This is a case of misunderstanding. And why am I misunderstanding this Chinese classical poem? Well, for instance, because I do not possess the linguistic code, so I don't speak Chinese. This poem was translated into a language that I know, English, for instance, in order for me to be able to read it and understand it. But maybe something was wrong with the translation, so I actually cannot access the meaning of the poem because the translation creates not a bridge but an obstacle. And you know, dear Chinese colleagues, scholars and students, how difficult it is, for instance, to translate some classics of Western philosophy, for instance, into Chinese and vice versa. How difficult it is to read Heidegger in Chinese, to read Nietzsche in Chinese. You read and you have the impression, or at least this is the impression that many of my fellow scholars have, that meaning to be grasped there is tremendously ambiguous. But it is tremendously ambiguous, and there is always the possibility of a misunderstanding, because in many cases something is wrong with the translation. The translation does not actually help the reader. On the contrary, the translation misleads the reader. The translation does not work as a bridge between the original text and the reader. But that is not the only reason for which I might misunderstand the text. I might, for instance, know Chinese very well. I might read a poem of a classical Chinese poetry, classical Chinese literature, and come up with an idea of the meaningful intentions of the author, of the poet, that are completely at odds, once again, with the intentions of the empirical author. So I might come up with an interpretation that is not in line at all with what the poet wanted actually to convey through that meaning. And the history of literary critique is full of these misinterpretations, of people who have read Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and then they have come up with the interpretation that, okay, this is definitely a condemnation of the role of people who are not completely sane from the mental point of view in society. This is a critic of the Western understanding of what a psychiatric equilibrium is. why do we come up with these interpretations that are completely at odds, or might be completely at odds with what the author wanted to communicate? Because although we know the language perfectly well, although I know perfectly well Chinese when I read this classical Chinese poem, something else is wrong. Something else is not working. What is not working is not knowledge of verbal language, because I know Chinese. What is not working is the fact that my code of interpretation, the code that I use in order to interpret this poem and attribute meaning to this poem, is not the correct one. I'm actually carrying on performing a misinterpretation. The decodification of this poem that I carry out is aberrant, is misleading, is deviant, because I'm applying, for instance, a contemporary sensibility to a text that was created many centuries ago. I'm interpreting a classical Chinese poem, for instance, through the lenses of, let's say, feminism. And so I'm attributing a feminist perspective to a text that was created when feminism was not even an idea. Feminism was not present in the ideology of a society. So what I'm doing in this case is not to interpret the text. I'm not interpreting Hamlet. I'm using Hamlet. That is a very important distinction. The distinction between interpreting a text and using a text. And it's a deeply ideological distinction. These are two different semiotic ideologies of approaching a text. On the one hand, I want to interpret a text, meaning that I want to extract from a text its meaning in the best possible way, which means that I must be faithful to the structure of the text and possibly also with the intentions of the author, with the idea of the reader that the author enshrined in this structure. But on the other hand, I might adopt a different semiotic ideology, a different approach to the text, and instead of interpreting the text, I use it. I use the text in order to achieve other goals, which are not the goals of interpretation. I don't want actually the text to speak by itself, but I use the text, and sometimes I use the beauty of the text, the ancientness of the text, the prestige of the text, the cultural prestige and literary prestige of a novel, in order to convey my own message. So I read Hamlet, I read War and Peace, I read the Bible, I read the Quran, but actually what I'm doing is not interpreting this text, I'm using this text in order to convey my own meaning, my own message. So I'm actually attributing, attaching an extra value, an extra prestige, a sort of a pedigree to my message, to my own message, to my own meaning, by claiming that this meaning was present already in a text that was cherished by an entire society, by an entire culture. But this is a deeply ideological move, is again not cooperating with the text. It is not trying to establishing a communication with the author of the text through this interpretation. It is, on the contrary, using a text like a pretext. What is a pretext? A pretext is an excuse. It's an alibi. It's something that we don't actually use for itself as a goal. Interpretation is not a goal, but it is an instrument. The text becomes a sort of an instrument to achieve other goals, which are, in many cases, ideological. So, it is now 8 o'clock here in Italy, 8 a.m. It should be 2 p.m. in China. And we have gone already through the first 45 minutes of our lecture today. We then take a very short break of 10 minutes, and then we resume at exactly past 8. So it's going to be 10 past 8 in Italy, and it's going to be, I think, 10 past 2 p.m. in China. So I'll see you back in exactly 10 minutes, and thank you for your attention so far. Okay, so welcome back, and we can continue our conversation today about semiotic ideology and semiotic ideologies of interpretation. And as you probably saw in the program, today we were meant to talk about time. Now, time is a very mysterious entity. It has a lot to do also with what we were saying before, with the semiotic ideologies of interpretation. What is the relation? Well, the relation is that on the one hand, you might conceive interpretation of a literary text, for instance, as an operation that can exclude the dimension of time. So, according to this semiotic ideology of time, history is not deep, has no depth as regards the creation of literary texts. So I can actually move across time from the present to, for instance, the 17th century England, and talk to Shakespeare, or at least let Shakespeare talk to me. And in this semiotic ideology of time, these centuries that have elapsed, this time that separates me, the reader, the empirical reader, from Shakespeare, the empirical author, are transparent, so they can be abridged by the literary text. On the contrary, you might have a different conception of time in literary interpretation, according to which these centuries, this time, this long stretch of time that separates me from Shakespeare, me, the empirical reader, from Shakespeare, the empirical author, is not transparent at all, but is opaque. It's not like clean water, it's like muddy water. So that the passage of time has changed not only the meaning of words, but also the meaning of stories, the meaning of what a story is, the meaning of emotions and passions. So, according to these different conceptions of time in interpretation, on the one hand, you have a critical approach that seeks to recreate some ancient conditions of interpretation in order to better grasp the meaning of an old text. And this is what traditional literary studies usually do. This is what philology usually does. An attempt at moving back to previous past conditions of interpretation in order to understand what really Shakespeare meant by Hamlet. On the other hand, you have an approach that denies this importance of time, that considers time as transparent, that considers that, after all, what is important is not to go back to those ancient conditions, recreate them in order to understand what Shakespeare might have meant. What is important is to transport this meaning back to our time, to read Shakespeare's text today, and to seek to understand what they mean today, in present time, given the present day conditions of interpretation. So these are two different approaches, but in general, any interpretation, any operation of interpreting science has to do with a certain semiotic ideology of time, the way in which we consider time as an agent or not in a society, in changing the conditions of meaningfulness in society. Now, time is a very mysterious entity. It is something that has been studied by many philosophers. Actually, one could even see the entire history of philosophy as an attempt at interpreting time. There is a beautiful quote that is due to that is a quote by one of the most famous thinkers of human history, Western history, Augustine of Hippo, one of the most important theologians and thinkers of Christian thought, but also someone who has now a universal importance in the history of philosophy. And Augustine of Hippo used to say in Latin, as you read in this quote, "Si nemo ex me querat scio, si querenti explicare velim nescio." That is, if someone asks me what time is, I know it. But if someone asks me to explain what time is, I don't know it. What does it mean? It means that we have an immediate, spontaneous, natural understanding of what time means to us, especially as regards physical time, empirical time. We might feel a little bit tired today because I, unfortunately, and I apologize about it, forced you to get up a little bit earlier or start a little bit earlier your classes. We see the passage of time, we see the traces, the evidence of the inexorable passing of time on the face of people that we love. We see that our parents, our fathers, our mothers get older and older. We see that ourselves, after a certain age, we grow older and older. Our hair becomes white, our skin becomes wrinkled, and so on and so forth. We see the passage of time on things as well. Things get deteriorated. Our houses, if we don't take care of them, become very old, and so on and so forth. So we see that things change, and we have an immediate impression that things change through time, through an abstract dimension that nevertheless we perceive as very familiar. And we perceive this dimension as familiar also from a subjective, although always quantitative point of view. When we are waiting for an interview or when we are waiting for an exam, that time of waiting is extremely long, it is extremely painful. In certain conditions, time weighs a lot. In other conditions, when we are happy with our friends, with our family, celebrating, and time is very light and flies away. So we have a perception of time. But if someone asks us, what is time? What do you mean by time? If an alien from a different world was to come here and ask us, well, please let me understand what time is, would we be able to explain to this alien what time is? Or we would have the same impression that Augustine would have. So, of being unable to actually put into words the meaning of time, putting into words what time is for us human beings. Now, I don't want to embark in a philosophical reflection about time because, as I told you before, basically all Western philosophers have dealt with time. Probably philosophy is a gigantic reflection on time. Some of the classics of 20th century philosophy are on time. Think about Heidegger's Time and Being, for instance. But what we are about to embark in is much more modest, is a simpler journey, although a journey which is also fraught with difficulties, is trying to understand what time is from a semiotic point of view, from the point of view also of the semiotic ideologies of time. So we are about to talk about time, but connecting this gigantic existential and philosophical topic to the main theme of our meetings, which is the concept of ideology, and in particular of semiotic ideology. So are there different semiotic ideologies of time? Of course there are. And we already offered an example, depending on how you imagine and conceive of the time elapsed between an author and his or her audience, his or her reader, you come up with a different understanding of the meaningfulness of a text, and also with a different idea of the operations that are necessary for that text to become meaningful again. So you see, this is a simple example, but to prove to you that ideologies of time are absolutely fundamental, also in the very central operation of semiotics, which is the operation of interpretation. So what is time for semiotics? Well, semiotics, of course, acknowledges the fact that there is empirical time, acknowledges the fact that physical time exists, that we live in time and through time. I have a certain time to teach semiotics to you, but it is not an infinite time. So I have an everyday, very material, very simple and straightforward experience of time. But what matters in semiotics is not measured and measurable time. It is not physical time. It is not the physical or biological experience of time. What is important in semiotics is the way in which time is turned into meaning. So the way in which a certain meaningfulness is attributed to time. So basically, what semiotics sees in time is not time in itself. It is not physical time. It is not biological time. It is time as temporality. So what is the difference between time and temporality? Time is a philosophical concept, is a metaphysical concept, is also a physical and existential, as well as biological and social concept. It is something that can be measured, it is something that can be experienced. But temporality is something different. Temporality is what emerges in a culture as a consequence of the contact and interaction between the physical, biological, existential dimension of time and language. So temporality is time, but experienced not only through the body, not only through the senses, but also through language. So you might ask, well, but language is everywhere. As semioticians point out, language permeates any aspect of our everyday experience. There is no semiotic moment in our life. Everything is part of a gigantic semiotic realm that starts with our birth and ends with our death. So, as a consequence, we actually never experience pure time. We never experience a purely physical understanding, a purely physical a predicament of time, because time is always come across by us through the filter of a language, which is not only a verbal language, is also a language meant as a very complex structure and system of signification. So this is something that is important to keep in mind when we approach this very complex topic, the topic of time, from the semiotic point of view. Even the experiences of time that seem the most deprived of any semiotic or linguistic dimension are actually deeply influenced by language, deeply influenced by a system of science. So it's true that I can, for instance, measure time. I can measure time with a clock. I can measure time with a calendar. I can measure and structure time with an agenda. But you see, our conversation is really the perfect example of how actually even this a quantitative approach to time is deeply influenced by language and culture. We do not, in principle, have the same calendar in the West and in the East. Of course, now we adopt the same calendar globally because we want to interact in a smooth way, as well as we try to structure the experience, the physical time of every person in the world so that we can all communicate and interact. So it's the afternoon there and it's morning here, but thanks to some international rules, so we can actually end up meeting at a precise time. But this is not the point. The point is that these systems of significations, these calendars, these agendas, these ways of structuring even physical time are a consequence of culture and also influence our perception and our interpretation of time in a very deep way. Then it must be also underlined that time is experienced as temporality also in the most material manifestations of it. I'm sorry. For instance, think about ancient Rome. I don't know how many of you have traveled to Italy already or might want to travel to Italy. You're always welcome and always invited, of course, and I hope that when this pandemic is over, you can all come to Italy and visit Turin and Rome and the other Italian cities. But if you go to Rome, you're going to come across beautiful buildings, and some of these buildings, some ancient temples, for instance, are made of a specific material, and this specific material is marble. Marble. The same material that is used then for many Christian churches, but is used also for palaces, also in China, not only in the West. So, what do we see when we look at marble? We see a material. Well, of course we see a material. Marble is a material, is a chemical material. You know, we can, if we are chemists, we can write down the formula of marble. We can describe marble from the purely chemical point of view. But what we see when we look at the marble of a temple is not only and not specifically, it is not predominantly that chemistry, that chemical description. What we see when we look at the marble of a temple in Rome is actually time. Or to be more precise, it is temporality. It is a certain conception of time, a certain message about time that is given to us through the usage of this specific material. So a little reflection among parentheses. What is the difference between a matter and material? We talk about matter. Matter is everywhere. Matter is the substance of the reality that surrounds us from the chemical and physical point of view. There is matter all around us. Physicists say also that there is an antimatter in the universe, but this is just a physical speculation. But when we look at marble, we don't actually see pure matter. We see, on the contrary, a material. And the difference between matter and material is the same as the difference between time and temporality. So matter is a physical concept, but a material like marble, like wood, like gold, is that matter that has already been shaped by language, has already been shaped by a particular system of science. So this means that when we look at that particular, not matter, but a material, we see not the physical marble, not the simple chemical structure of this specific matter, but we see a matter that has been already shaped by language and by a system of science and has been attributed meaning. And what is the meaning of marble? Why are Roman temples built with marble and are not built with wood? They are not built with bricks. They are not built with rocks. They are built with this material, which, by the way, is a material that has been explicitly chosen because it's not a material that was easily found in Rome. Constructors, workers should travel far away, should go to Tuscany, to the Apuan Alps, and very painfully and time-consumingly extract marble from there. So it was an explicit choice. It was not a simple material to get. It was not an easy material to work with. It was, on the contrary, extremely hard to cut, extremely hard to extract, extremely hard to build with. Nevertheless, the Romans built all their temples with marble. Why? Because marble was the material element, was the material, the matter shaped by language, through which they could say, this is a special building. This is a building that has a different relation with time. This is a building that, through marble, expresses, manifests a different temporality. A temporality that says, I'm here to last. I'm here forever. I'm here not to decay. I'm here to stay. I will stay for a long time. I, temple of marble, will stay beyond your life and the life of your children and the life of your grandchildren. I will stay here generation after generation, and I will stay here even after invasions, even after enemy soldiers will conquer the city, because marble attests this, attests the permanence of the building, attests the permanence of the deity, the gods that are actually venerated through the temple, through the building. It attests the continuity through time of a certain cultural element. So marble is adopted in order to give a statement about the continuous presence, or at least the wished continuous presence, of a certain cultural element within a society. The same goes for other materials. You see, when people get married in Italy, as well as even when they get married in other countries, societies, and cultures in the world, they exchange rings, wedding rings. And what is the material of these wedding rings? Are they made of glass? Are they made of wood? Are they made of plastic? No, these rings are unmistakably and systematically made out of gold. What is the meaning of gold? What is the meaning of gold in Western culture? What is the message that is communicated to the two families that are involved in a wedding when the bride and the groom exchange rings made out of gold? Well, again, the message of this material is that this marriage is not temporary. This marriage is not fragile. this marriage is not a hidden relation. On the contrary, this marriage is going to last as gold, as a chemical material, as chemical matter lasts. It is going to shine and be visible exactly like this material, this chemical matter, gold is. And it's going to be precious. It's going to be rare. So this is why in weddings, rings are not made out of marble, which is something that lasts, which is something that cannot be easily destroyed, but at the same time does not have the two other properties that the semiotics of gold has, and that also insist on a certain temporality, on a certain conception of time. So when the bride and the groom exchange rings at the wedding, they're implicitly saying this marriage is going to last forever, or at least until we are alive. This marriage is going to shine, is going to be visible to everyone, exactly like these golden rings shine. But this marriage is going also to be precious, a rare thing. The fact that I've come across, I've met someone with whom I want to share all my life. This is going to be a unique experience. It is going to be something as precious as gold. So you see, every time that we use a specific material, we are expressing also a semiotic ideology. And vice versa. We cannot really interpret the artifacts that surround us in a culture if we do not understand the meaning of that specific material, the specific material these artifacts are composed of. Especially important for us is to understand again what is the temporality that these materials express. So, for instance, when I go to a Chinese museum of arts, I came across many objects that are probably precious and are preserved in museums. If I go to the beautiful Shanghai museum, the Museum of the City of Shanghai, I'm going to come across many objects that are made out of jade, this usually greenish, light, luminous material that is so common in Chinese art craft. But as a Westerner, as a Western visitor of a Chinese museum, I come across all these objects. All these objects look precious to me, look beautiful. The fact that they are in a museum tells me that they're probably very treasurable, but I do not actually understand their precise meaning because I do not know jade. I do not know what jade means in Chinese culture. I don't know what this material conveys in the complex semiosphere of Chinese culture. I don't even know what is the temporal meaning and connotation of this material. So I might look at these objects made out of jade, but most probably I will also partially at least misinterpret them, meaning that I'm going to lack an important element of knowledge in order to correctly decode them. Then I will have, of course, to study or to ask my colleagues or to ask my students, and I will also ask you at the end of this class, what is the meaning of jade? Which is so common in Chinese art craft. But the same goes for other materials. What is the meaning of silk, for instance? Silk that is so common in garments and clothes of some cultures and civilizations, but I might not precisely know what the meaning of this material is from the temporal point of view. What is a material that is considered as meant to last? What is a material that is considered as... And mind, this is very important to keep in mind. these temporal connotations are not always a consequence of the physics of matter, are not always a consequence of the chemistry of these materials. Why? Well, because we have a certain kinds of plastic nowadays that are more resistant than gold, that are actually more long-lasting than gold. They are more long-lasting than marble. So these specific plastic materials have physical properties that might even exceed those of traditional materials like gold or marble. But nevertheless, what do we think when we see something that is made out of plastic? What would we think in the case where our groom or our bride gives us a ring that is made out of this plastic? We would immediately think, oh, this is not good, because this material, although from the chemical and physical point of view is a very long-lasting one, as a cultural connotation, as a temporal ideology attached to it, which actually signals the fact that this is disposable, this is something that can be thrown away, this is something that can be replaced, and above all, this is something that is not natural. It has not natural element. It's not like marble, it's not like gold. This is not found in nature, it's not found in mines, it is not found in mines or found in caves. It is a material that has been concocted, created by human beings. So the meaning that it conveys is artificiality. Plastic will always have this connotation, whatever we do. And that's why if we want to give a prestigious connotation to someone, we don't use plastic. If we want to build a beautiful, prestigious, a high-class car, we'll use as little plastic as possible. We'll use materials that at least look like they were natural materials. So this is to say that materials tell something about themselves, tell something about the cultures that they have chosen them for those particular purposes, but they also say about something about time in a way that is not always connected with their physics or with their chemistry. It is connected with how these materials have been interpreted and used culturally by a certain society, also in order to convey a certain meaning about time. What is, for instance, the semiotics of glass? What do we say when we offer a glass object to someone? Well, a glass object might be beautiful. A crystal object might be beautiful. Crystal is a beautiful material. But at the same time, does this material have the same temporal connotation, temporal meaning of gold? Of course not. Crystal has a connotation in relation to time of a prestigiousness, of elegance, but also fragility. We wouldn't give to a bride or groom a ring made out of plastic, but we wouldn't either give it or her a ring made out of crystal or glass, because that would immediately imply that, well, this marriage is fragile. This marriage can break. This marriage is not destined to last. This marriage might go into 1,000 pieces, might look beautiful, but then deep down is innerly fragile. So you see, all these materials have something to say about time, and this is also another further piece of evidence about the fact that time, as we experience it in a society, always comes to the form of temporality. Even when we experience the time that is enshrined in materials, those materials are a product of the encounter between matter and language. But temporality can be also much more complexly enshrined in the artifacts of a society. After all stories, all narratives are about time. A narrative is nothing but the transformation of a certain relation into a time representation. This is the main concept of narratology, of the school of thought that tries to apply semiotics to the interpretation of stories and narratives. You're probably familiar with the semiotician Greimas, or the famous narratologist Vladimir Prop or Gérard Genet. You know, all these authors, we cannot go into details now, but for all these authors, a story, a narrative, a literary story, but also a folk tale, were nothing but a way of somehow decorating, transmitting in a temporal form a certain understanding of society. Now, here there is an interesting dialectics of semiotic ideologies, which is difficult to grasp, but I want to at least hint at it. You see, on the one hand, you have in the Western philosophical tradition of the second half of the 20th century, phenomenological approaches to time. Probably the most important representatives are authors and philosophers like Merleau-Ponty or Paul Ricoeur. And you see, Paul Ricoeur, a very famous French philosopher, wrote a gigantic study on the relation between time and tales, temps et récit in French. And the main message of this gigantic study is that we narrate stories, we create narratives because we want to cope with time. We want to deal with time. Stories and narratives are actually the most efficient anthropological device through which human beings cope with time. But semiotics has a different semiotic ideology of time. For semiotics, for people like Greimas, for instance, is exactly the opposite. So Paul Ricoeur would say, yes, we narrate stories, we create narratives, because actually we want to cope with something that is very difficult for us to grasp. The concept of the passage of time, the fact that our being emerges from time and then sinks back into time. It emerges from time with our birth and sinks into time with our death. But according to Greimas in structural semiotics, it is actually the opposite. So it is not that we create narratives in order to cope with time. We create narratives because we project a temporal dimension, a temporality, to important relations in our culture and society. So it is not that a time is difficult to understand. It is an important element in the mysterious relation between life and death, and so we create stories in order to understand this element. This is Paul Ricoeur's position. The position of Greimas in structural semiotics is that what is difficult to understand is exactly the relation between life and death. And time is just a literary narrative illusion that we project on that relation in order to understand it better, in order to understand how these dialectics between life and death work. So you see, these are two diverging semiotic ideologies. On the one hand, time comes before narratives, Paul Ricoeur. On the other hand, narratives come and narrativity comes before time, Greimas and others. In the perspective of semiotics, as a consequence, time is experienced always as temporality, as a structure a linguistic structure, discourse structure, that is projected onto a reality, for instance, in the construction of a story. Now, what I would like to introduce, though, is the idea that semiotic ideologies are to be found not only in individual texts that might use time in order to build a temporal illusion, a certain temporality, but also in cultures as a whole. So a way to define a culture, a way to define a semisphere, is also the analysis, the study of how an entire culture perceives time, lives through the dimension of time. You will say, well, but time is subjective, everyone has a different perspective on time. There are some people who are more impatient, some other people that are less impatient. There are those who are constantly running out of time, others who are, on the contrary, constantly squandering their time. So this is a psychological feature. It is not a cultural feature. But this is not entirely true. It is not entirely true because time is also a social dimension. It is a dimension that is lived not only individually by single individuals, but also collectively. So I might have my understanding of time. I might be in a certain position about time. I might hold a certain perspective about time. But at the same time, I will never be completely alone in that. My idea of what time is, what is the appropriate way of living through time, is also influenced by a certain temporal culture, by a certain semiotic ideology of time that attributes meaning to time not only from an individual point of view and on an individual basis and in a single psychology, but in a society as a whole. So what is time, for instance, for present-day Chinese society? Is the semiotic ideology of time in China today different than the semiotic ideology of time in present-day Italy or United States or Africa? So can we study these different semiotic ideologies of time through space, how they change from culture to culture, and also, can we study how a semiosphere changes its semiotic ideology of time through time? So, is, for instance, the way of experiencing time and living to time of the Chinese culture at the beginning of the 20th century the same as the way of experiencing a Chinese culture and the way of experiencing time through language of Chinese culture in the present day time? Do Chinese young people, for instance, think about time in the same way as young Chinese people would think about time in the beginning of the 20th century? Of course not. Of course, a general understanding of what time is in the life of an individual, how it might be better and best used, how should be employed or saved or squandered, what is actually to be valued in time. This is something that changes with the semiotic ideologies of time. And one of the purposes of semiotics is also to study the cultural artifacts that circulate in a society, novels, movies, objects of design, and so on and so forth, in order to understand what is the conception of time, what is the semiotic ideology of time that hides behind those objects. So For instance, in Italy, elderly people usually say and complain, well, you know, clothes nowadays are not exactly like clothes 50 years ago. Clothes 50 years ago, they say, were meant to last. We would buy those clothes and then they would last forever. We would buy a coat and then that coat would be given to the younger brother and then to the other younger brother and so on and so forth. We would repair these clothes. We would not throw them away when they were when they had some imperfections. On the contrary, we would mend them because these clothes were meant to be with us for a very long time. On the contrary, they say, they complain, clothes nowadays last one season and then we throw them away and we buy other clothes. So you see, this is a discourse, popular discourse about clothes, but it's not only about clothes, it's also about time. It is also about the semiotic ideology that we attach to the objects that circulate through a society. And by circulating through a society, they also express a certain semiotic ideology, a certain idea of what time is and how is it best to live through it. So on the one hand, you have a semiotic ideology of continuity, a long-lasting understanding of how the materiality of objects should be. And on the other hand, you have a typical feature of consumerism, which is the idea that subjectivity lasts through time, experience lasts forever. We are going to be buyers and consumers all our life through, but the objects that we consume do not actually last. Most of our objects, even the most complex ones, the most expensive ones, will be actually replaced. Our clothes will be replaced after one season. Our computers will be replaced after a couple of years. Our cell phones as well. What stays is only very symbolical objects, which as a consequence are usually very expensive, which are jewels. Not even houses in some cultures are meant to last. In some cultures, I remember, for instance, when I was living in Australia and teaching in Australia, I would be impressed by the fact that the materials that were used to build apartments were very fragile. There was a lot of plastic. They would break very easily. But my friends, Australian friends, would tell me, well, but you see, this is not meant to last. This is not sold to last. These apartments are built so that you live in there 2 years, 3 years, and then you move somewhere else and the apartment is torn down and another new apartment is built. So the conception of materials to be used in a house in Italy is completely different. You know, the people want their house to stay there forever, to be very solid. They don't want wood, they want bricks, they want cement. If they can afford it, they want marble because they want to legate that same apartment to their children, to their grandchildren. So they have a different conception of time, which is not the typical conception of time in consumerism. So it is now 9 o'clock, and we're gonna have another short break of 10 minutes. So we're gonna resume at 9:10. And at 9:10, if everything is okay from the technical point of view, we're going to also meet a Professor Bruno Surace, who is the special guest of today. He's an expert on time, but especially as this time is enshrined into specific texts, which are movies. So we have a short break of exactly 10 minutes, and then we resume at 9:05, 9:10. Okay, thank you.